You probably think you're too sensitive. That criticism hits you too hard. That rejection stays with you too long. That small moments linger when they should pass. And somewhere along the way, you were told this was weakness, but Carl Jung saw it differently. He believed that emotional fragility is not a character flaw. It is a sign of a structure that never fully formed, because strength is not the absence of feeling. Strength is the ability to contain feeling. Most people don't collapse because they feel too much. They collapse because everything goes straight to the core. A comment feels like a verdict. A failure feels like an identity. A mistake feels permanent. There is no distance between experience and self. Jung called this a permeable ego, an ego without firm boundaries, where the world constantly spills inside. In this state, you don't experience life. You absorb it. Other people's opinions become your inner voice. External chaos becomes internal instability. And criticism doesn't inform you. It defines you. You try to protect yourself. You toughen up. You withdraw. You overthink. You rehearse conversations that never happen, but none of it works. Because real resilience is not about becoming harder. It's about becoming structured. A bulletproof mind is not cold. It is contained. It can feel deeply without collapsing. It can listen without dissolving. It can face reality without being consumed by it. Jung believed this capacity is built, not inherited, and that many adults never develop it because early life taught them survival instead of selfhood. This video is not about silencing emotion. It's about building the psychological architecture that allows emotion to exist without ruling you. Not confidence, not motivation, not positive thinking, but inner structure. Because once structure exists, the world no longer breaks you. It informs you. When something hurts deeply, it's rarely the event itself, it's the lack of distance. Carl Jung observed that people with fragile emotional resilience often experience life without psychological separation. There is no buffer between what happens and who they believe they are. A comment doesn't stay a comment. It becomes a judgment of the self. A failure doesn't remain an experience. It becomes proof of inadequacy. This is what Jung meant by a permeable ego, an ego without firm boundaries, where external stimuli penetrate directly into identity. In this state, emotions are not processed. They overwhelm. You don't feel sadness. You are sadness. You don't feel shame. You become shame. And because the ego lacks containment, the psyche looks outward for regulation. Other people's reactions become emotional anchors. Approval brings temporary relief. Disapproval triggers collapse. Life becomes reactive. This is why criticism feels devastating. Not because it is harsh, but because it enters unchecked. The psyche has nowhere to hold it. The mind begins to develop coping mechanisms. You become hyper-aware of others. You anticipate rejection. You scan conversations for danger. This is not weakness. It is survival. The psyche is trying to prevent injury by predicting it. But prediction is not protection, because the real issue is not what enters the psyche. It's the absence of internal structure to contain it. Jung believed that ego boundaries are formed through validation, reflection, and gradual differentiation in early life. When that process is disrupted by conditional love, emotional unpredictability, or excessive pressure, the ego remains exposed. As an adult, this creates a painful paradox. You crave connection, but connection threatens you. You want honesty, but honesty wounds you. You oscillate between closeness and withdrawal, strength and collapse, until you learn the central truth of psychological resilience. The goal is not to stop feeling. The goal is to build an ego strong enough to hold feeling without becoming it. And that begins by understanding how this fragility was formed, not to assign blame, but to reclaim control. The ego does not emerge fully formed. It is built slowly through mirroring, safety, and permission to exist as a separate self. Carl Jung believed that when a child is allowed to express emotion without fear of abandonment, the psyche learns something essential. Feelings can exist without destroying connection, but when love becomes conditional, the lesson changes in emotionally unstable environments. Children learn to adapt instead of individuate. They learn which emotions are acceptable, which thoughts must be hidden, which behaviors keep attachment intact. Authenticity becomes dangerous as the child fragments. One part performs, another suppresses, another watches carefully. This is not pathology, it is intelligence. The psyche chooses survival over truth, but what protects the child weakens the adult, because when emotional expression is punished or ignored, the ego never learns containment. It never learns how to hold inner experience independently. Instead, regulation remains external, approval soothes. Disapproval destabilizes, and over time, identity forms around response rather than reality. You become who others need you to be, not who you are. Jung called this the false self, a personality built to secure belonging, not wholeness. Outwardly, this can look like success, competence, adaptability. Inwardly, it feels hollow. You may struggle to name what you want. You may feel anxious when unobserved. You may sense that something essential never fully arrived. This is why adulthood often reactivates childhood wounds, because adult life demands autonomy, decisions, boundaries, self-definition, and without a solid ego structure, those demands feel overwhelming. Criticism reopens early wounds. Rejection feels existential. Conflict threatens identity. But Jung insisted this is not a life sentence. What failed to develop early can be developed consciously later. The psyche is not frozen in time. With awareness, structure can be built where it was missing. But first, you must understand this. Your sensitivity did not come from weakness. It came from adaptation, and adaptation, once conscious, can be transformed. Asterisk, when the ego feels exposed, it does not remain passive. It builds armor, but not all armor protects. Some only hardens the wound. Carl Jung warned that when the ego lacks inner structure, it compensates with defenses that look like strength but actually preserve fragility. One of the most common is arrogance, not confidence, but the need to appear untouchable. This form of arrogance is not rooted in self-trust. It is rooted in fear that if you stay superior, no one can reach you. If you stay critical, no one can expose you. But the cost is isolation. Another common defense is emotional withdrawal. You convince yourself you don't need people. That independence means detachment. That distance equals safety. Yet nothing strengthens the ego here. It only avoids the conditions where growth could occur. Perfectionism is another false armor. If you do everything flawlessly, you believe criticism won't land. Mistakes become intolerable because they feel catastrophic. But perfectionism does not eliminate fear. It traps you inside it. There is also preemptive aggression. You attack first. You dismiss others before they can dismiss you. You turn vulnerability into hostility. This may feel empowering in the moment, but it keeps the ego rigid and brittle. All of these defenses share one thing. They are reactions, not structures. They don't create containment. They only redirect anxiety outward. And because they are not rooted in inner stability, they require constant maintenance. You must always be impressive, always distant, always correct, always guarded. This is exhausting. Jung believed that true strength does not come from defending the ego, but from strengthening it. An ego with real boundaries does not need armor. It does not need to dominate or disappear. It can receive criticism without collapsing. It can be seen without performing. It can engage without losing itself. False armor keeps you safe from pain, but also from growth. And until it is recognized for what it is, it will continue to masquerade as strength while quietly keeping you fragile. Asterisk. The first step toward becoming mentally bulletproof is not. Confidence.it is distance. Carl Jung taught that psychological strength begins the moment you stop identifying completely with your inner experiences. Most people say, "I am anxious." Jung would ask you to notice the difference between that and "I am experiencing anxiety." That distinction changes everything. When emotion and identity merge, the ego is flooded. When they separate, the ego becomes a container. This is the birth of the observing ego. The observing ego does not suppress emotion. It does not analyze it away. It simply watches, and in watching, something remarkable happens. Emotion slows, not because it is resisted, but because it is no longer you. You become the space in which experience occurs. This creates what Jung called psychological distance, the ability to hold inner content without being overtaken by it. The observing ego allows you to feel anger without acting it out, shame without collapsing, fear without obeying. It transforms reaction into response. But this skill does not arrive naturally if it was never modeled early in life. It must be practiced. You begin by noticing language, not "I am worthless," but a thought of worthlessness has appeared. Not "I am overwhelmed," but overwhelm is present. This may feel artificial at first. That's because your psyche is used to fusion, but over time, this simple shift builds structure. The ego learns that it can experience intense states and survive them. And survival is the foundation of confidence. Jung emphasized that observation is not detachment. It is intimacy without possession. You do not push emotions away. You allow them to exist within a wider field of awareness. This is how emotional intelligence begins, not through control, but through containment. The observing ego is the cornerstone of mental resilience. Without it, every experience threatens identity. With it, experience becomes information, and information, unlike emotion, can be integrated. Carl Jung believed that nothing weakens the ego more than denial, not denial of facts, but denial of parts of the self. Every trait you were discouraged from expressing did not disappear. It went underground. Anger that was unacceptable, desire that was inconvenient, confidence that felt dangerous, selfishness that threatened attachment. These qualities form what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is simply unlived life. And what remains unconscious does not rest. It acts. It leaks through tone, reactions, judgments, and triggers. This is why certain people irritate you disproportionately. Why specific criticisms feel unbearable. Why small slights provoke outsized reactions. You are not reacting to the present moment. You are reacting to the shadow being touched. Jung famously said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Shadow integration begins with a difficult truth. What wounds you in others often points to something disowned in yourself. Not because you are the same, but because the quality exists in potential. This does not mean acting out every impulse. Integration is not indulgence. It is acknowledgement. When the ego refuses to recognize the shadow, it becomes fragile. Why? Because denial creates blind spots, and blind spots invite projection. You see your own aggression everywhere, but within. You see arrogance everywhere, but within. You see weakness everywhere, but within. This constant projection destabilizes perception. Reality becomes distorted. People become threats. The world feels hostile. But when the shadow is consciously recognized, something shifts. You no longer need to defend against it. You no longer fear exposure. You gain flexibility. The ego becomes whole rather than split, and wholeness is strength. Jung did not believe mental resilience comes from purity or positivity. It comes from integration. When you can say, "This too exists in me," the psyche relaxes. Nothing hidden can control you. Nothing denied can ambush you. And the ego, no longer guarding against itself, becomes remarkably stable. Once the ego can observe emotion, and once the shadow is no longer denied, a deeper task becomes possible. Carl Jung called this task building the center. Without a center, the psyche remains dependent. It orbits around approval, reaction, and circumstance. With a center, the ego gains gravity. The inner citadel is not rigidity. It is not stubbornness or self-importance. It is an internal reference point, a place where identity is anchored regardless of external fluctuation. Many people believe they have a core identity, but what they actually have is a collection of roles: worker, partner, achiever, caretaker. When these roles are challenged, the self collapses. Jung warned that identity built on function is always fragile because function can be removed. The inner citadel is built from inner evidence, not external validation. What you have endured, what you have faced honestly, what values you have tested and chosen consciously. This is why suffering, when integrated, strengthens the ego, not because pain ennobles, but because it clarifies. The ego learns. I survived this. I remained intact. I did not disappear. These realizations accumulate. They form psychological walls, not walls that isolate. Walls that contain. A person with an inner citadel does not need constant reassurance. They do not collapse under criticism. They do not inflate under praise. Feedback becomes information, not identity. This is what Jung meant by ego stability. You can be wrong without being worthless. You can be rejected without being erased. You can be misunderstood without being threatened. The citadel is strengthened every time you respond instead of react. Every time you tolerate tension instead of fleeing it. Every time you act in alignment with inner truth rather than external demand. This structure takes time, but once formed, it changes everything. The world no longer feels like an assault. People no longer feel like judges. You stand somewhere, internally, and that standing is what makes you mentally bulletproof. Once the ego begins to stabilize, a strange thing happens. The noise becomes clearer. Carl Jung noticed that as external pressure loses its grip, an internal voice often grows louder, harsh, critical, and absolute. This is the inner critic. Most people assume this voice is their own judgment. Jung strongly disagreed. He saw the inner critic as an internalized authority, a composite of early voices absorbed before the ego was strong enough to resist them. Parents, teachers, institutions, moments of shame. The critic speaks in certainties. You always fail. You're not enough. Don't try, you'll be exposed. Its tone is not reflective. It is punitive, and crucially, it does not evolve. The inner critic never learns from experience. It does not update with evidence. It does not soften with growth, because it is not you. Jung believed that identifying with this voice is one of the primary sources of psychological suffering. When the critic speaks and the ego obeys, self-trust erodes, motivation becomes fear-based, rest becomes guilt. Achievement brings only brief relief. The task is not to silence the inner critic. Silencing creates repression, and repression gives the voice more power. The task is to relate to it. Jung used a method called active imagination, engaging inner figures consciously. Rather than submitting unconsciously, you listen to the critic. You question its absolutes. You notice its age. Often, it sounds younger than you are. This recognition creates hierarchy. The adult ego steps forward. The critic loses authority. It may continue to speak, but it no longer commands. This shift is profound. You stop confusing punishment with truth. You stop equating harshness with wisdom. The psyche reorganizes. Discipline becomes choice. Standards become flexible. Mistakes become instructive rather than humiliating. A mentally bulletproof person does not lack an inner critic. They simply refuse to let it define reality. Carl Jung believed that psychological strength is revealed not in certainty, but in tension. Most people try to resolve inner conflict as quickly as possible. They want clarity, consistency, a single answer. But Jung saw this impulse as a form of weakness because maturity does not come from eliminating opposites. It comes from holding them without collapse. You can be confident and uncertain, strong and vulnerable, ambitious and content. The fragile ego cannot tolerate contradiction. It demands simplicity so it chooses extremes. Either I am capable or I am nothing. Either I am right or I am worthless. This rigidity creates instability. Because life is complex, criticism will be both valid and unfair. Success will be real and incomplete. You will be growing and unfinished at the same time. A mentally bulletproof ego does not rush to resolve this tension. It allows opposing truths to coexist. Jung called this the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to grow by remaining in discomfort long enough for a deeper synthesis to emerge. This capacity changes how you relate to challenge. Criticism no longer destroys you, nor is it automatically dismissed. Praise no longer inflates you, nor is it required. You listen, you evaluate, you integrate what is useful and discard the rest. This is emotional adulthood. You stop outsourcing judgment. You stop defending identity at all costs. Instead, the ego becomes flexible without losing its center. Holding opposites requires patience. It requires trust in the psyche's capacity to evolve. But this patience is what makes you resilient, because life will never be clean. People will never be consistent. And certainty will always be partial. Strength lies in staying present without fragmenting, not closing the question too soon, not collapsing into extremes. This is the final refinement of mental armor, the ability to remain whole in the presence of contradiction. Mental toughness is often misunderstood. It is mistaken for emotional coldness, for dominance, for unshakable confidence. Carl Jung rejected all of this. That he believed that true strength is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not harden into armor. It contains that a mentally bulletproof person still feels doubt, still feels fear, still feels pain. But these experiences no longer define identity. Emotion becomes weather, not terrain. This strength is built slowly, through observation instead of reaction, through integration instead of denial, through self-trust instead of performance. It is not about eliminating weakness, but about expanding the psyche's capacity to hold experience. When this happens, something profound changes. You stop fighting yourself. You stop performing for approval. You stop mistaking intensity for truth. Life becomes less threatening, not because it is safer, but because you are more whole. Jung believed this was the goal of individuation, not perfection, not happiness. Wholeness. A self that can face reality without fragmentation. A psyche that no longer needs constant defense. This is what it means to be mentally bulletproof, not unfeeling, not invincible, but integrated. And once integrated, the world can no longer break you, because there is nothing left inside that needs to be protected from itself.